all 28 of you that I see are participating here. It's I always love talking to the master naturalists because it's such a great group of people and everybody's always so interested in and such. And so thank you for this opportunity to talk about one of my favorite things, San Pedro Springs. Oh, let me see, I got to get rid of that little message. Okay, so this painting here is from the 1840s, and it's by Theodore Gentiles, who was known, he was one of the early artists in San Antonio, and he was known for painting things with this dead-on accuracy. And you see here how he painted San Pedro Springs, this green shade. And as some of you probably heard me say just the other day recently, green is the natural color of water from the Edwards Aquifer. So he got it right. He painted it green, and that's the color that these springs are around here. I'm going to start here with some material that some of you might have seen just a few weeks ago when I talked to the training group, but it's a good enough story to tell again. And as you guys know, this is the Edwards Aquifer region, and that blue area there, the dark blue area, is the artesian zone of the Edwards. This is just an amazing aquifer. You can go anywhere in that blue zone and dark blue zone and drill a well and get drinking water delivered to your doorstep under pressure in a lot of cases. There's no other aquifer like this in the world. And the early explorers and travelers through this area, they described a lot of the natural springs from the Edwards as being natural fountains like this, sometimes gushing water many feet in the air. This is the only one left I know of that still has a natural fountain appearance to it. This is one of the Barton Springs in Austin. But a lot of the springs were described this way, as these natural fountains, and all the rest have been, walled up or sealed in, or they're under a lake or something. Just this one still has that natural fountain appearance to it. Now, this is the part some of y'all might have just heard, but this is a good enough story to tell again. The Indian tribes, the natives in this area, they believe that one of the functions of this painting, this is a painting that's near Del Rio, Comstock area, and in a rock shelter, and it's 4,000 years old, called the White Shaman Panel. And the natives believe that one of the functions, one of the purposes of this painting was it served as a map or a guide that they would use to go on a sacred journey to visit the fountain springs of Central Texas. They believe that these 4 black dots here, I hope you can see my mouse, they're connected by this squiggly line that represents water. They believe those are the fountain springs of Central Texas, which are these 4, Barton Springs in Austin, San Marcos, Comal, and then San Antonio and San Pedro. I'm going to make a hydrogeologic case here that San Antonio and San Pedro Springs are all one big spring complex. But if you lay that portion of the painting over the aerial, it fits pretty well. So they're pretty good geographers for 4,000 years ago. And when I heard about this sacred journey they would go on, I thought, well, I'd always go out and talk about the Edwards and try to get people to visualize what these places must have looked like then, but I didn't have any graphics to show people. So a couple of years ago, I commissioned an artist to paint me these places as they might have looked to a little group of Indians that's on this journey 4,000 years ago. And I started this project by asking for their permission, because these are very sacred sites to them. And they were all into it. They were all about it. They were so great about sharing their culture and their story. And by the way, I took some heat in a public setting the other day for calling them Indians. A lady said, well, you should call them Native Americans, is disrespectful. So I want to say that I call them Indians because they asked me to. I asked them, what do you like to be called? And they said, well, first of all, we like to be called by our tribal name. And beyond that, we don't mind being called Indians. They said, we like it because it had that indigenous root word to it. And they said, hey, look, you're a Native American, but you're not an Indian. So I guess this falls in the category of you can't please everybody, but that's why I call them Indians. So, and they told me that on this sacred journey, they would never go counterclockwise. They always went clockwise. So they would have gone to Barton Springs first. And that's the one we saw in the video there. And they might still recognize this place today. Of course, Barton Springs, as you know, probably is like the holiest site in Austin. My friends in Austin tell me how much they love Barton Springs. Of course, the springs themselves the main spring is underneath this swimming pool. And so I question them. I say, well, if you really love the springs, maybe you would want to like take out the dam and let these be natural fountains again. Are you sure that what you don't love is a place where there's all these willowy blondes and beefcake? And so I don't have that many friends in Austin, actually. Well, then our little group would have come down the road, what is now I-35, to San Marcos. But the Indians call this site Yana Ahuac, and it means sacred springs. And out of all the spring sites around here, this is the one that's the most sacred to a lot of the tribes. They believe that this is where their people were born. This is their creation story. They told me that when they were in their spirit form, they don't really know what they look like, but they believe that they were born as people after they followed a deer through the underworld on a hunt, and they emerged from those fountain springs there as human beings. That's their creation story. So very sacred site to them. Of course, this became a theme park in the 1900s. If you grew up here anytime between the 1940s and the 1990s, it was a rite of passage to go to Ocarina Springs theme park. They had frolicking mermaids and swimming pigs, and they had an underwater theater there that was like a marvel of the engineering world in popular mechanics in 1952. It's all gone now. It was bought by Texas State University. All the infrastructure of rides was taken out. That's where the gift shop was. It's all replanted back in native vegetation. The only thing left from the theme park days is the old hotel, which is now the Meadows Center for the Environment. And the other thing left is glass bottom boats. And that's how you view the springs. The water there has this exceptional clarity, and the young people from Texas State give these really great tours on the boats there. You look down through the bottom of the boat and you see the springs bubbling up. That's a field of low pressure springs called Cream of Wheat. But some of the high pressure springs are so strong that from 10 feet down, you can see them trying to break the surface of the water. So if they took out the dam that creates Spring Lake, those would still be fountains. And it really bugs the Indians, by the way, that these springs are underwater there. These are some of the endangered species that live in San Marcos Springs, the fountain darter, and this is the Texas wild rice, the only place in the world it grows there in San Marcos. So then our group would come down the road to Camel Springs in New Braunfels. And these two spring openings there are those two. They might recognize this site today. You know, this is the epicenter of water recreation in Texas. This is all spring fed. None of it comes from city water. You got your New Braunfels tube chute. Across the street is the famous Schlitterbahn Water Park. And then just downstream, there's a bridge where you can see the combined flow of all the springs there. These are the biggest springs in the American Southwest. And on this day, the flow was about 200 million gallons. That's a lot of water coming from those springs. So then our group would come down the road to San Pedro Springs. This is the blue hole at San Antonio Springs. And each one of these paintings had a theme. And the theme we used for this painting was trade, because the Indians told us that they said that, you know, San Antonio being on the geographic crossroads, all the north-south, east-west roads go through town. They believed that this was sort of a neutral territory. It was a place where the tribes, they could set aside their differences and they come here and do trade and ceremonies and weddings and burials and all these things. So we did a trade scene there. This is what the blue hole looks like today, surrounded by this concrete structure. It doesn't flow very often, but when it does, it actually sometimes does have a blue tinge to it, which is unusual for Edwards water. Still a very sacred site to the Indians. They still do ceremonies there. I happened to catch some people from the Aquifer Authority grabbing a sample that day. There's many other springs up there in the basin besides the Blue Hole. And so it's the combined flow of all those springs up there that historically were the headwaters of the San Antonio River. Some are just as big or bigger than the Blue Hole. And the Indians have another creation story about the Blue Hole. Their story is that a long time ago, there was a blue panther that lived in the Blue Hole. And the water bird Anhinga came to rest on the water, and the panther leaped from the Blue Hole at the bird, and the bird flew high into the sky, and wherever the drops of water fell from its wings, that's where life sprang up on the land. So that's the story that Indian tribes in San Antonio have of how life and things got started here in San Antonio. Well, back to this one for a second. There's something else in this painting that we tried to depict, and it's very subtle, but it's this line of trees in the background here. And we did that to try to convey the notion of a managed landscape, or maybe a forest garden. And this came out of a bunch of work that was done on the Mission Reach not that many years ago. They took out like 8 miles of concrete drainage ditch, and it was all replanted with native vegetation. They put meanders back in and hiking and biking trails. There it is in 2016 and just a few months ago. But while they were doing that work, they found 3 areas down there where it looked like people had been living there permanently. And this was a surprise to everybody because we had always pictured the native tribes in this area as being like transient bands, never staying anywhere very long. But it looked like people had been living there permanently. And the archaeologists were surprised when the radiocarbon dates came back at 6,000 years old. So there's this new emerging view among the archaeologists and the historians. Now, we've probably underestimated the number of people that were here. And what they were doing probably is they were managing the landscape. They knew that if they planted a pecan, that the next generation would have nuts. So they were managing the landscape with plantings and with fire. And this probably applies to all of North and South America. And so, the irony here is that 4,000 years later, how are we now managing the river corridor with plantings and with fire? So we're right back to the original management method. But, I always mention this when I talk to the naturalists. I think that what you guys really are as naturalists is managers, is environmental managers. This is a quote from Charles Mann in 1491. He wrote a book about what the Americas were like before Columbian contact. And like I said, there's this emerging view that the natives here were far more numerous than we've thought, and they were managing the landscape in a sustainable way. And that's sort of the lesson that we can learn from them. That's what we're trying to do today. That's what you guys are helping with, is trying to figure out how to manage our resources in a sustainable way. So we're finally getting to San Pedro Springs here. Then they would come down the road to San Pedro Springs. They're in San Antonio already. And as you probably heard me say when I did the other presentation a few weeks ago, there's so much local history here. This was, there's so many things that happened first at San Pedro Springs. This was the social and recreational center of the city for many decades. And, now most locals don't even know about the place. So I always love the opportunity to talk about all the history here. But I also want to talk real quickly about why there are springs there at all. And this is a graphic here of what's under the ground along this line in Bexar County from northwest to southeast. So the Edwards limestone here is in these blue blocks, and the limestone is divided up into these units here by faults, such that some of these blocks are touching and some are just barely touching, and others are not touching at all. So it's these faults that, and the slope of the land, they're controlling the direction of flow, especially these barrier faults. When you get up to this fault here, this is the one where the springs arise from. Water butts up against this limestone and has no place to go. It doesn't have the porosity and permeability the Edwards has. So one thing that the water can do is if you can picture the water being deflected into the pitcher up toward Camel Springs, the other thing that can happen is that water can get forced up to the land surface along this fault plane simply because of the pressure of water that's higher up out here. It is, water down here, down deep, is under all this pressure simply because there's water higher up. So water can get forced up along a fault plane to the land surface. And that's how all the springs work. They all occur where there's a fault line and water can get pushed up to the surface by natural pressure. And the San Antonio Springs and San Pedro Springs, they're only a couple miles apart, and they occur along the same fault line. So I would make a case that it's all one big spring complex. There's other spring complexes in the Edwards that occur like over a 9-mile stretch of river, and we call all those Las Moras Springs. So we call them San Antonio and San Pedro, but really all one big spring complex. Here's another one of those dip sections. You see where there's this almost a complete barrier fault right here under New Braunfels. And so here the water has no place to go but up. And that's why the big springs are in New Braunfels. So here's San Pedro Springs when they were flowing a few years ago. Each one of these pools has like a distinctly different shade of green to it. Some are more green or less green or aquamarine green. There's other places in the park where springs will bubble up in little pools like this. When they were flowing, this was the combined flow of all the springs on that day. This swimming there was officially not allowed, but that didn't seem to bother anybody. And this was the combined flow of all the springs that was leaving the park and then going down San Pedro Creek. This is where the major springs are located. The swimming pool, if you're familiar with that, there were a lot of springs that were underneath the pool originally. That was originally a kind of a little lake. Those locations of those springs are now kind of lost to history. Others of these springs, A and B here in front of the bandstand, those have been plugged. They no longer flow. It's mostly D, E, F, and G, which are what we think of now as the major spring outlets at San Pedro. And then there's a little pool over here with J, H, and I, where you'll often see water bubbling up in like these little bitty openings whenever the Edwards is high. So the first European that we know of that was at San Pedro Springs was this Father Espinoza in 1709. He was here on one of the early Spanish entradas or expeditions into Texas. They were afraid of, they came to fear a French incursion into what they thought was their territory, the Spanish did. And so they were looking for places, to settle people and sort of create a buffer against the French. Well, they came across this place, and Father Espinoza described passing through this grove of trees, and they came to an irrigation ditch, many trees and enough water to supply a town full of taps and sluices of water, and they named it Agua de San Pedro. So this conception that the father had of an irrigation ditch and these terraces, that was probably a misconception. There's really no evidence at all, the archaeologists would tell you, of the Indians doing irrigated agriculture anywhere in the San Antonio River Valley. Some of the tribes looked on it with disdain because this was a lush enough area where you could live fat and happy off by hunting and gathering off the land. There was no need to do irrigated agriculture. So he also described these terraces. They were familiar with terraced agriculture in South America, but the way that the Edwards limestone erodes, you'll see this all over the hill country because some layers are harder than others. The limestone tends to erode in a stair-step fashion. So he may have been seeing some of these terraces that were probably originally north of the springs there, where the tennis courts are today. That was one of San Antonio's very early rock quarries. So all those terraces and such were all taken out, and a lot of the early buildings in town were built out of rock that was quarried right there from the springs. So probably not an irrigation ditch with taps and sluices and irrigated terraces. So on this same expedition in 1709 was a Father Olivares, and he spent 9 years trying to get permission and funding to come up here and start a mission. Now, he needed military protection, so Commander Alarcon was the military contingent that was assigned with escorting and protecting him, and they didn't get along at all. They took separate routes up to San Antonio. Father Olivares there in 1718, he actually founded San Antonio on the site of San Pedro Springs. He held the first mass there. And then Alarcon went a little ways downstream and built his first fort. And so that was what became the Alamo. That was right down here. This is where the Christopher Columbus Church is today. That is very likely where the first version of the fort was, which then became the Alamo after it was moved 2 or 3 times and finally ended up where it is downtown. So he was charged with protecting the settlers that were settling up here around the springs. And one of his other duties was to start building San Antonio's first acequia. So as you probably know, there was a system of 7 of these that were eventually built, but the first one was at San Pedro Springs, and it started there at the south end of where the swimming pool is now, and it went back into the river about where the Tobin Center is today. That was the first acequia. So then in 1729, the King of Spain declared this to be an ejido, or a public park, public space. And then in 1731, the Canary Islanders came along. And you probably always heard that the Canary Islanders were the first settlers in San Antonio. Well, really they weren't. There were civilian settlers that were doing the hard work up here of clearing the land and building this acequia and developing fields. And then what happened in 1731 was the Canary Islanders came along. They didn't expect to have to work in the first place. They thought they were coming here to be like minor royalty. And so the original settlers got pushed off the land, and the land was given to the Canary Islanders. And I've always speculated that, maybe some of like the bad blood between rival gang factions in San Antonio, maybe it goes way back to that, where some of those very early families that had done the hard work got pushed off their land in the very beginning for the Canary Islanders. So in 1785, Philip Nolan was an American, and he brought a pack train to the park, what is now the park, and he's credited with establishing American-style commerce in Texas, which was also at that time known as smuggling, because none of that was legal. You had to get permission from the King of Spain to, buy or sell anything. One reason that the missions were unsuccessful was because if you wanted to buy a shovel, you had to write to the King of Spain and get permission for that. And, by the time the boat got to Europe and back with your permission, a year had passed, and it just didn't work out. But Philip Nolan was an American smuggler who is credited with starting what we think of as commerce in Texas. And, the park there is the place where San Antonio's relationship with the military started. San Antonio came to be known as the mother-in-law of the Army, because so many of the local girls married Army officers. And, in 1841, the Rangers and the Comanches, they were doing exhibitions of horsemanship there. In 1845, the 2nd U.S. Company of Dragoons were stationed there. In 1854, the U.S. Camel Corps used the park for a while to stable camels. They were doing this experiment with using camels in Texas. They were on their way to Camp Verde, which is out there just north of Bandera. Camels in Texas is something that never really worked out, but they tried it for a while there. And then before the Civil War, Sam Houston made a 2-hour-long speech in the park against secession. He was totally against that. And then, of course, Texas did secede. And then by 1863, during the Civil War, the Confederates had a prisoner of war camp there. After the Civil War, the 9th Cavalry of Buffalo soldiers were stationed there. They just put up a new plaque in the park to the Buffalo soldiers. I don't have a picture of it, but it's right there at the top of the springs. So all of this is what started San Antonio's relationship with the military. They offered some land around the springs, 100 acres, to the military because they saw the benefits of having the military here, but it was too small and there were too much potential for Indian attacks, so they didn't take a city up on that. But that's what started the whole relationship with the military, was when they camped at San Pedro Springs. And then just after the Civil War, J.J. Durler, he leased some land around the park, and then he got permission to live on the park. And he's the one who developed it into what we think of as like a public park. He, did fish ponds and a speaker stand and exhibition building and boat rentals and horse track and all these things. And so the period from about after the Civil War, 1865 up until about 1900, that's the period that was really the heyday of the park as like a public meeting space. It was all there was. There was no Brackenridge Park yet. Everybody went to San Pedro Park. Back in those days, almost every day in the newspaper was this advertisement about San Pedro Springs, advertising all the wonderful things that you could do there. Here's an old engraving of a petting zoo and a beer garden that they had there in the park about 1875. And the other thing that the park was the cradle of San Antonio sports. Almost every sport in San Antonio that's popular today, and some that aren't, started in San Pedro Park. Baseball, polo, cricket, football, golf, shooting matches, dancing, all of that stuff started in San Pedro Park and was done there first. Bicycling, there was a bicycle racetrack there. It all started in San Pedro Springs. So we get up to the postcard era, starting in about early 1900s, 1904, 1905. Between then and about 1915 or 18, there are just many, many postcards that I've collected, probably more than 75 different postcards of San Pedro Springs. A lot of them were never mailed, which tells me that people were buying them sort of as a keepsake of a day in the park. I'm just going to show you a few here of my favorites. It's an old hand-colored, a real photo postcard, actually a photograph that's hand-colored. In the park was a famous tree-lined path known as Lover's Lane. There, if you can picture where the bridge over the pond used to be, the swimming pool, on the east end here, you can still make out some traces of it with these trees that are still there. There was that's where Lover's Lane was. So, who can guess how many romantic interludes occurred there in San Pedro Springs Park over the years with people strolling down Lover's Lane? So now we're going to play for a minute. We're going to play San Pedro Mythbusters. And usually I ask people to like show of hands, true or false, and I can't do that here. So I'm going to just do the best we can here. But there's a lot of myths out there about San Pedro. So I'm going to try to bust some of those. So one myth is there were a lot of alligators. And I can't see your reaction, so raise your hand, true or false. That's true. There were a lot of alligators. Up until the first swimming pool was built in 1923, I don't have any pictures, no postcards, no accounts of anybody actually getting in the water. There was a newspaper article in 1922 where they were apparently feeding dogs from the city pound live to alligators in the park. And this created, as you can imagine, this created a big public ruckus, and they put an end to that pretty quickly. There's another story where there was a pavilion built out over the water, and there were so many people on it that it collapsed into the water. and everybody ran shrieking from the alligators. The alligators never offered to actually hurt anybody, but they all ran like hell from all the alligators that were in the water. What about this? There's this myth out there. You will see this in many, many publications. It's the second oldest park in the nation. Well, there's a plaque in the park, right, that says it, that says so. So it must be true, right? Wrong, that myth is busted. If you look at the Trust for Public Land, they have a list of the oldest parks in the country. San Pedro Springs is number 10. I mean, it's old, but it's not the second oldest. Anybody who believes that, you know, you have to ask, well, have you ever heard of St. Augustine, Florida, established in 1573? So that myth is false. San Pedro is number 10. Here's another myth. The first powered flight occurred here. There was a Jacob Brodbeck, who was a German inventor from Fredericksburg, and he is credited with conducting the first powered flight. This was before the Wright brothers, but there's kind of, it's not known. There's some accounts that he did this up near Luckenbach, and there's other accounts that he did this exhibition in the park. And that would make sense to me if he did it in San Pedro Park, because he was looking for funding, and it would have made sense to bring his airplane down to the park and do an exhibition there to try to get funding for this. Well, it didn't really work out. His plane crashed, and so he never went anywhere with that. And the Wright brothers ended up getting credit really for the first powered flight. So that's a bona fide myth. Nobody really knows if it actually occurred in Luckenbach or in San Pedro Park. Here's one you'll hear. The bandstand was moved here from Alamo Plaza more than 100 years ago. That is busted. There's newspaper accounts where the bandstand was built right there on site. They even tell you exactly how much it cost, what the materials were, and such. So that myth is false. Here's one you'll hear pretty often. Buffalo Bill had a Wild West show here. So I looked it up. That myth is busted. There's a Buffalo Bill museum where they have a list of all the shows he ever did. And there's 5 or 6 of them in San Antonio. So I looked them all up, and it turns out that San Pedro Park, it just wasn't big enough. These things were huge. These shows were huge. They needed a train. They needed access to a railroad to bring everything here. So most of these shows Buffalo Bill did were very close to the train tracks. They were down there on the sort of where the train depot is, south of downtown, or down on the exhibition grounds, which was south of town on the San Antonio River. But he never had a show in San Pedro Springs Park. It was the only place in town to see Chinese waltzing mice or an anteater taught to walk a slack wire. Well, you can't make this stuff up. That is absolutely true. It was the only place in town to see Chinese waltzing mice. The city's first Natural History Museum, which was a forerunner of the Whitty, and the city's first zoo were both there in San Pedro Springs Park, and they had a lot of odd attractions like that. Well, how about this one? The zoo was moved to Breckenridge Park, and if there are 3 official websites I could list today where you could go and you can see that's what they say. The zoo was moved to Breckenridge Park. That is busted. This myth was just busted a couple of weeks ago by a historian friend of mine. She tracked down what happened. It turned out the zoo was sold to a fellow in St. Louis, and Paula Allen in the newspaper wrote an article about this a couple of Sundays ago. But the zoo was not the zoo at San Pedro was not what became the zoo at Breckenridge Park. Totally separate. How about this one? Professor Romig would leap from a balloon with his monkey before crowds of more than 1,000. Well, once more, you cannot make this stuff up. Yes, he did that. He was a regular performer there. And there were others that would do diving exhibitions from balloons. You could take a balloon ride yourself in the park if you wanted to. Here's a myth you'll hear. The blockhouse is the oldest building in Texas. Probably not. That is probably not the case. It's probably built in the 1850s. there was an archaeological report that came out a couple of years ago where they made the conclusion that the blockhouse was not even there in 1899. Well, they should have asked me, because I can produce definitive proof that the blockhouse was there in 1899 and long before that. But it's not the oldest building in Texas. About this one, there was a cannon here at one time. That is absolutely true. There was a cannon here at one time, maybe two, and not just any cannon, but maybe the cannon, the 18-pounder cannon that Travis fired at Santa Ana in defiance at the Alamo. In 1899, there were a bunch of cannons that were dug up on Alamo Plaza. One of them was moved to the park. And then in December of that year, just a few months later, a fellow wanted to celebrate Christmas on Christmas Day, and he put a charge into the cannon and he tried to set it off. And the cannon exploded because there was already a cannonball in it that was rusted, and there was already a charge in it. And so the back of the cannon exploded. And what happened to the cannon after that? We know that the pieces of it were displayed in the museum there for some time. We don't really know what happened to the cannon. I have heard some anecdotal stories from people at the water system where I work that the cannon eventually became unsightly and was rolled off and buried in the acequia here. And so this scruffy looking guy, his name is Rick Range. He's a friend of mine. He's a fairly well-known historian. And his thing is, what he's trying to do is he's trying to find all the guns, all the cannons that were at the Alamo. And he's had pretty good success. He actually found one a couple of years ago, and they brought it back to the Alamo. So he came down here a couple of years ago, and he brought about 6 guys with metal detectors. And our objective was to see if we could find this cannon that may have been rolled off into this acequia. And so we had with us, which is not exactly legal, okay? Metal detecting in the park, but we had Hector Cardenas with us. He's the president of the Friends of San Pedro Springs Park. So we're doing this there, and we're not there 5 minutes, and the police show up, and they're like, "What are y'all doing?" And so Hector says, "Well, Gregg here works for the water system, and we're trying to find some old water lines because we're going to do some work here." And the cop says, "Oh, okay." And so then he wanted to stand around and talk for a long time. We're like, "Come on, get out of here." So the short story is, we didn't find it. We think we need, like, stronger, ground penetrating radar, but there's a chance that there's a cannon buried in San Pedro Springs Park. This one is not really a myth that's true or false, but one I want to tell you about. There's this story about the lure of Lolita. This Richard Wallace Buckley wrote this story in 1911, and it's about something that he claims happened about 1851. There was this Vincent Boone who was a traveler, and there was a terrible storm, and he was looking for a place to take shelter. So he got to San Pedro Springs Park, and he knocked on the door of a hut, and this Pedro Lara answered. He was this old, dark man, and he noticed right away that Vincent Boone seemed to have like a fat money bag on him. So he offered the blockhouse as a place for Vincent Boone to stay overnight, and he introduced Mr. Boone to his beautiful young daughter, Lolita. So Mr. Boone was kind of wary, so he decided that he was going to sleep with his clothes on, with his gun on his chest. In the middle of the night, he hears a rustling and some noise inside the blockhouse, and so he lights a match, and he sees Pedro Lara with a knife coming at him, and the match goes out. And so he fires into the darkness, and he lights another match, and Pedro Lara is nowhere to be seen. And then Lolita rushes in, and she points out where Pedro Lara's body had fallen through the floor into a trap door. She said that she was not his daughter, that she had been bought by him when she was a child, and she had been used by him over and over again to lure visitors to stay in the blockhouse so that he could rob and kill them. So whether or not any of this is true, nobody knows. But one thing we do know is that when the city extended San Pedro Avenue past Dwyer, they did uncover a cave there with 3 skeletons in it. So here's a part of the presentation that we don't really get to do. This is the springs in 3D. So I have this collection of stereo view cards, and I worked out this Photoshop technique to combine the images into one. So you don't have to use a stereo view. You can just use regular 3D glasses. So normally I bring 3D glasses for everybody, and we look at these, but we can't do that tonight. So if you have some 3D glasses, go on the website and you can see these for yourself. These things are very hard to buy, by the way. The people that collect these, they don't care about money on eBay. If you bid 100, they'll bid 300. Last week I went 375 on one and got outbid. So I don't think they're collecting water things necessarily. They're just collecting stereo views of early San Antonio. So the beginning of the end for the spring flows there comes in about 1891. There's this newspaper article that talks about how a well was drilled nearby and it had this impact on spring flows there. What had happened just months earlier was George Brackenridge had drilled the first large well into the Edwards Aquifer. And this is what he got. So, when people started drilling these wells into the Edwards, the spring flows there started to decline. And so by 1915, this is the last of the postcards. There's just not enough water anymore to support all the water features that were there. There just aren't any postcards after about 1915. And so the use of the park started shifting to other things. It was still a very popular place, but the uses started shifting to other things. In 1915, they did a renovation and built San Antonio's first public library. They did build a swimming pool in 1923, even though spring flows were meager. The idea was that they could capture what little there were. This was San Antonio's first public swimming pool. But then within a decade or so, they couldn't even fill it anymore with water because spring flows were so low. So it sat unused. And then in 1954, the HEB, Charles Butt, he sponsored building a second swimming pool. This one was filled with city water, so they weren't relying on spring flows anymore. But that one also fell into disrepair and was just sat unused for many years. And so the uses of the park started shifting to all these other things. The McFarland Tennis Center was built there, the San Pedro Playhouse. And by the way, this was modeled after the Market House, which was this downtown. That's what it was the Market House. But the ladies from the Conservation Society, they tried like hell to save the Market House when the city wanted to demolish it, and they were unsuccessful. But the city threw them a bone. They built the San Pedro Playhouse with the facade there that replicated what the Market House looked like downtown. So a whole generation, maybe two, of San Antonians grew up without ever really knowing spring flows in San Pedro Springs Park until 1991, when the Edwards Aquifer rose to its record high and the springs flowed again. And so this sign here that stands there said no swimming, but people didn't care about that. They all went back into the water. Then in 1993, a couple years later, the city developed a master plan to do a lot of improvements to the park, a brand new swimming pool. This was opening day on May 20th, 2000. On the other side of the pool there were dignitaries making these long speeches. And what was supposed to happen was on cue, there were a bunch of people who were supposed to jump into the water. So at the very last minute, they announced that nobody was going to get in the water because the other city pools were not open yet. There was no lifeguard on duty. So meanwhile, on the other side of the pool, this little lady here, she like peeled off her socks and she got in. And she stood there for a couple minutes before her dad came over and made her get out. So on opening day, she's the only one that got to go in the water. And to me, that kind of exemplified the history of San Pedro Springs Park. There was never any one like grand historical event that happened there. It's a whole lot of little events for people and families over many generations and years. And then in 2013, the city developed another master plan to put in, walks and lighting and signage. All the parking was moved. It used to be down here next to the bathhouse. All the parking was moved up here to the periphery. Some of these things have not been completed yet. There's still work to do on the grotto and the blockhouse. But attention started focusing on the creek itself downstream. This is a press photo from 1959 showing the creek downstream there. And it was shortly before they did this. They channelized and straightened San Pedro Creek for flood control. And, you know, water engineers today, they know that you really don't have to do that to a creek to get flood control benefits. There's ways that you just don't have to do that. And so 50 years later, the River Authority and the county came along with a plan to redo San Pedro Creek and turn it back into something that's more naturalistic. And so these were some of the early concept drawings. This is one of the early concepts for a bridge there. And this was deemed in public meetings as being too gaudy even for San Antonio. So that fell off the radar. But I want to show you some before and after pictures. This is close to the Christopher Columbus Church there, where the first mission was. This is Santa Rosa Street. That's before and after. This is Martin Street before and after the improvement project. Here we've got Travis Street before and after. So they've done really fabulous things here. Houston Street before and after. And then Confluence Park, which is where the two rivers meet, the San Pedro Creek and the San Antonio River. They meet at Confluence Park, which just opened a couple of years ago. So we have another, this is opening day with Suzanne Scott from the River Authority making a speech. So we have another fabulous community amenity now along San Pedro Creek. And they're doing phase 2 of the San Pedro Creek project now. Eventually it's going to go all the way down to the park. This is the reason why a lot of the streets downtown are closed, because they're doing all that work like right behind the Spanish governor's palace. So I'm down to my last 2 slides here, and the last thing I want to talk about is the value of water. So I was in the state capitol a couple of years ago, and I went in, it was lunchtime, we went into the restaurant there, and I don't normally buy bottled water, but I picked up this bottle of Texas spring water, and I bought it for $1.25 because on the back, it says the source is San Pedro Springs, San Antonio, Texas. And I thought, well, what the heck? That can't be. I mean, you know, so I emailed this DB Miller here of DB Miller Incorporated, and I said, I was curious about this because these springs they only flow like once in a decade, and I don't know of any like authorizations from the state to be diverting water for something like this. And tell me about this. So he answered back, he said, well, we can't know for sure which spring this water would have come from. And so that's sort of an admission that this is tap water. And so then I contacted the manager of the restaurant there in the Capitol building. I said, look, I just want you to know that what you're selling here, it's not what it's advertised to be. It's not from San Pedro Springs. And furthermore, I don't think they should be exploiting the idea that this is spring water to sell, you know, tap water. So it was a week or 2 later when they stopped selling this water in the state capitol. So then I did the math and I calculated, well, if I was just going to use tap water, how many times could I fill up that bottle of water from the tap for my $1.25? And I could fill up that bottle of water 4,301 times for $1.25. And, you know, tap water, you know what it is. At SAWS, we test that water every day. We're regulated. The bottled water industry, for the most part, they're not regulated. You really don't know what's in the bottle. So, so there's that, you know, what's the water worth? Well, I did some more math and I calculated that compared to dirt, if you're going to landscape your yard with a cubic yard of dirt, you're going to pay about $27 a yard. You can buy a cubic yard of water if you're in the lowest rate tier at SAWS for 32 cents. So water is far cheaper than dirt. And I would assert just as valuable or more valuable on a unit basis than dirt. So that's where I'm going to stop and try to answer any questions y'all might have. I'm going to stop the share so I can see y'all's faces.
Okay, let's see. We've got a few good questions. Let me. The first one, the picture you showed of the blue panther and Anhinga, where is that statue located?
Oh, those are in a little park that is right across the street from the Hilton Hotel, in right at the southern tip of Hemisphere Park. There's a little like kiddie park there now, and that's where those were put about, I don't know, 5-6 years ago.
Great, beautiful statues. I think we're gonna probably be going down there to take pictures soon. Then I've got a few questions about sort of tunnels and underground systems. We've heard a myth about a tunnel from the blockhouse of San Pedro towards downtown. Can you shed some light on that?
Yes, that's another myth I left out. That is totally untrue. There's no evidence whatsoever. They would not have had the ability to build a tunnel from San Pedro Springs Park down to the Alamo. It's just not true. There was a bear pit there where they kept some bears in a pit. That was where the myth started, is that there was this connection to downtown. That's not true. There is a tunnel under the Alamo now. It's the San Antonio River Flood Tunnel, which passes almost directly under the Alamo, about 90 feet underground. So, but there was no tunnel back in the day to the Alamo.
Okay. What about any cave systems around the park? We've got one student who's got a map of the Robber Baron cave system, and it looks like it goes through San Pedro and into downtown, and maybe some myths about using it to transport liquor during Prohibition.
Well, yes, in Robber Baron Cave, there was a very well-known speakeasy down in the cave there. And, you know, it's really hard to know. The Edwards limestone is all hydrogeologically connected, and there could be some connections or extensions that go in all directions from there. And you just never know until you start digging and, you know, find these things when you're digging roads or making road cuts or something. We know there were some caves in San Pedro Springs Park. There's another legend about a stash of gold that was buried there in the park, in a cave that nobody ever found. But it would have been underneath where the tennis center is today. So there could be a chest of gold in a buried cave under the McFarland Tennis Center. That's another myth.
Some fun lore to think about. Back to the original stories, talking with the Indians, was Anhinga, did you get that as word of mouth from the Indians? Was it maybe a cormorant?
Yeah, I think an Anhinga, I think that is a cormorant. Yes, that story has been told 3 or 4 times. It was told. I almost memorized that story verbatim from a newspaper article where the Indians were talking about that story.
And is the flow of the San Pedro Springs as good as it's going to get, or can it be restored somehow?
So the ground elevation there is at about 663 feet above sea level, and the Edwards Aquifer today is at about 657. So the Edwards has to be at about 665, 670. You'll start to see some flow there. 675, you'll see a lot of flow. But the thing is, we're not managing the Edwards. We're managing the Edwards to maintain spring flows in New Braunfels and San Marcos. So I just don't see in the long term, really, I don't see where we're going to be able to manage the Edwards for spring flow at San Antonio and San Pedro Springs. It's just in one sense, it's just the sacrifice we made to have a city of 2 million people here. Those springs are just not going to flow very often, except for when the Edwards is very high.
Okay, that looks like it's all the questions we've got so far.
Oh, then do I get to tell the story about my Indian name? So, so the Indians know that I work in the sewer. And so they know I appreciate a good potty joke. And so they told me that a good Indian name, it needs to have a superlative in it, and it needs to have a reference to nature in it. And then they named me Breaks Great Wind. I can see y'all laughing about that.
Oh my goodness. We do have another really great question that came in. Is there a way to predict when the Edwards will be high?
If you like pay close attention to rainfall and the Edwards level at the J17, which they talk about on the news almost every day, there is a general rule of thumb that I use. If you get about a 1 inch rain over a big general rain of about 1 inch over the recharge zone, you'll see the J17 come up about 1 foot. So last night we got 3 or 4 inches over large parts of the recharge zone. I would expect the well to be coming up 3 or 4 feet in the next day or so here. It's not exact. It's, sometimes it doesn't work out that way, but in general, about 1 foot I've noticed for 1 inch of general rain.
And it takes about a day or two to notice the effects. Is that right?
Well, the pressure is actually transmitted instantaneously. So you'll see the J17 rise almost immediately. Now it takes a while for additional water to recharge, to filter in when it's running off the plateau. So you'll see the Edwards continue to come up for a couple of days after a big general rain. But because it's all connected, I mean, the instant that water goes in out in Uvalde, Medina County, you will start to see the J17 start to come up.
Fascinating. And another really great question. You mentioned some species that live in the San Marcos Springs. Is there any life or diversity in the San Antonio Springs and San Pedro?
Well, we don't have any endangered species in San Antonio or San Pedro Springs. There's no doubt in my mind that they were there, but they've been extirpated many years ago. Probably about 1900 is the first account that I have of the spring starting to go dry. This is because of all the Edwards wells that were being drilled. And before that, I don't have any accounts. I've been studying natural history here for a long time. I've never heard of any accounts of any of the springs, any of the rivers or creeks around here going dry before about 1900. And so there were undoubtedly were oddball species there that we would think of as endangered today, but none have survived.
Okay, I think this recent rain is on everybody's mind. Is a hard rain more conducive to resulting in a rise in the aquifer?
I think a long gentle rain is more beneficial. Now, with a very hard rain like a gully washer, what happens is it all runs over the top of the recharge zone and doesn't have time to go underground. But if it rains very gently and slowly over a period of, good general rain over, like we may get here later this week, a good general rain that takes a couple of days, there's just more time for the water to go underground before it flows past the recharge zone, if that makes sense.
And have other diversion dams been discovered downstream of the springs?
For the aqueducts, you mean? Yes, there's there for each one of those 7 acequias the Spanish built, there was a diversion dam. There was 2 of them that started in Breckenridge Park, and one of them, the only one in the nation that is still completely intact, is buried next to the river underneath Hildebrand Avenue, where right by Incarnate Word there. There's a plan there to try to uncover it. A couple of years ago, the archaeologists discovered it's all still there. So one of the park renovation plans now is to uncover that thing and put up some interpretive signs so people can see it. There was another diversion dam in the park that was behind where the Whitty Museum is now. That was the diversion dam that fed the acequia that went to the Alamo. That one is all gone. There's really nothing left of that one. But any rock that you pick up in that part of the park was probably part of the dam. And I will say, don't pick them up. Just, let them lay. I'm one of those who believes that if you see an artifact, you should just leave it, because there's what little is left, we should just leave it. It matters that stuff is still there.
We are very excited for the acequia field trip coming up soon. Let's see, one more question. We hear the water is really great to drink in San Antonio. So are water softeners in the home necessary or desirable, or is it maybe just a racket to get some money out of our wallets?
So I'll bet you that none of us had a grandmother that had a water softener. And yet today, they come standard with almost all new houses. Now, they condition the water. What they do is they exchange calcium, which is in the water. They exchange it for sodium, which doesn't contribute hardness to the water. So you don't get the scaling and such on your fixtures and all. But there's a side effect to this. When the water softener regenerates, all that calcium goes into the sewer system along with the sodium that it's exchanging it for. And so this is a real issue. My office is down at one of our big wastewater plant, the Stephen M. Klaus plant. And this issue of total dissolved solids in the water we get is a very, very big up and coming issue that we're going to have to address as a community, because we don't treat for this. The conventional treatment plant doesn't address dissolved solids. We just pass them through to the San Antonio River. So, and there's only so much salt that the river can take and still be healthy. So to me, that's the best argument not to have one, is that you're contributing to salinity downstream in the San Antonio River. And we're quickly getting to the point where the river just can't take anymore.
There's a lot of water nerds on this webinar today. We've got another good question regarding historical pre-1900 large floods along the San Pedro. Have you heard of any large historical floods that have been exacerbated by all the expanding urban fabric around it?
So I want to refer you to a brand new book that was done by Char Miller. I can't reach my copy here. Let's see if I can get it. Oh, here it is. I want to be sure I get the name right here. It's called West Side Rising by Char Miller, who was an instructor at Trinity University for many years. And he just wrote a book about floods in San Antonio and how it started an environmental justice movement. So that's a good source to read about those early floods in San Antonio. This book just came out about 30 days ago.
Fantastic. I think that's all of the questions we have now.
Well, we thank you, Gregg. That was really interesting. You brought up some new things that I don't remember hearing before. So that was really exciting.